mean,
so like if I'm seeing a series of things that like reliably go against my representation of the world, the thing that updates itself is not the world, but my representation of it.
well, yeah. Have you ever seen any illusions?
Sure.
Like especially with this, well, what's illusionist stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, did it change your understanding of the world?
No.
But it was like completely against your understanding of
Sure.
physics, right?
But there's
So what happened?
there's a different kind of, I guess, primer there that is saying like I know that when somebody is an illusionist.
Okay, but not always you know it, right?
Well, then I suppose ontologically speaking, I would be at a sufficiently reliable, like to a certain extent, I would be cool.
Again, it depends on your model of the world, because if it's like strong enough, you would reject it, because like even you see it, it's
Okay, guys, I just
it's not supported by constraints of your model, right? Oh yeah, we can continue later.
Like we can.
Super interesting topics.
I think this is a really interesting, important topic. As we kind of get to it and get through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
So pretty much all of the arguments that I'm going to be presenting up until the very end of this are going to be Brian Kentwell-Smith's arguments. Is it okay if I start now, like properly? Or no?
Yeah, sure.
Are you waiting anybody else?
Yeah, we're still waiting for some people, but I suggest we start now and they'll just show up later. Okay, yeah, thanks everyone for joining the call, and thanks for everyone who's here in the room. Today we'll hear the presentation from Emre Alca. Emre, thank you for taking time to prepare it, and yeah, looking forward to hearing more about the research of Cantwell-Smith and his book. And I'm sorry, I forgot the name of it.
So all of the arguments that I'm going to be presenting today, at least for the first like 2/3 of this lecture, are going to be pulled from Brian Cantwell-Smith's book that was just published last December, which is The Promise of Artificial Intelligence, Reckoning, and Judgment, which describes why all current models of like mechanical minds or of like machine intelligence are going to fail to be like fully conscious, and they're going to fail to be like properly equivalent to our minds on the level of judgment. But this isn't to go against like the notion that they're going to have massive power to perform reckoning. These are the words that Brian uses. What he means by reckoning is like a very determined certain kind of like inferential judgment. That like these are things that you can understand without having an actual model of the world for yourself.
Without having?
Well, if there's let's get into this a little bit. There are two kinds of systems of AI that Brian discusses, which is like the good old-fashioned AI using his mentor like John Haugland's terms, which is like it's the basis behind every kind of like if you're listening to this, you probably know what GoFi is.
Yeah.
We're like it's based on these 4 Cartesian assumptions, where like so the first thing is that the essence of intelligence is absolutely thought. That the way that we think about everything, all cognition is based on logical inference, and so on and so forth. Second one is that like perception is at a lower level than thought, and it's really quite simple, and that like the ontology of objects is discrete, and there's a distinct difference that's easily describable between every object that exists. Like all concepts are in their own little category. These are the assumptions behind GoFi, which I think most people can already see some problems with it. So this makes a couple of other vital assumptions in the way that it works. The system works mechanically in ways explicable by science. That is to say that like everything is working mechanically. There's some kind of set of encoded steps that we could use to describe every process sequentially. All cognition is described. But the system supports semantic interpretation. That is from one point I can assume all other points, and that in general semantic relations to the world, including reference, are not affected. That means that I can only know what I am perceiving, and there is no difference between knowing what something means and knowing what something is. I don't need to understand something for myself to be able to use it as an object. This fails for a series of vital reasons. Most importantly, I'm going to focus very much so on epistemological and ontological failures here, is that it assumes that intelligent systems are purely based on logical inference, and GoFi systems can't learn for anything. They can't learn anything. It says that all notions of intelligence, all notions of cognition are inherent. John Vervaeke in his lectures tells us a story of one time when he was in a developmental psychology class as a worshiper of Jerry Fodor at the time. He's he walks in there. They're talking about developmental psychology, how you learn skills as you grow up and use those skills to learn further skills. And he's like, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as development. Baby plus delta baby equals adult. This is to say that because all cognition is computation, then baby plus delta baby is adult because there is no way to encode anything new into the system itself because everything is formal and there's no such thing as plasticity. Major vital assumption. The second part is that the world is easily describable and that perception is used. This was eventually the failure of GoFi. That it would only work in systems where the machine was capable to know absolutely everything in the world it was describing. You would know in the system, the system that beat Gary Kasparov at chess knew where every chess piece was at all times and all of the rules that govern it. But if you put it in a system that it doesn't know everything, it fails to understand it. So let's say that we have some tree line and we have a smoke signal coming up out of the trees. A GoFi system would fail to connect the fact that the smoke signal would be a symbol of something burning.
It depends, yeah.
Well, because it couldn't confirm it. It couldn't be aware of the fact that there was a fire down here. It couldn't make the inference that smoke leads to fire because it doesn't have that immediate understanding in its predefined representation of the world.
It completely depends on how it's built and what knowledge encoded in it.
Well, the thing is, if it doesn't know that there's some other thing here, it's incapable of thinking that there is anything below it.
Right, it's true for any system.
But we don't have,
including people.
Sure, we have the capability to learn that.
As well as artificial systems.
But not under the architecture of GoFi.
Specific architectures. Yeah.
For sure. So there's a series of failures here. And GoFi fell out of favor in the 1990s, leading to a bit of a disparity over the 90s and the development of artificial intelligence, after which Jeffrey Hinton essentially became God. And his wake-sleep algorithm of deep learning kind of erupted into the mainstream almost overnight. Well, how does ML stand up to these ontological problems? One, most importantly, they can actually learn. But that's pretty much all that they can do. A neural network is purely a model for rather than inferential logic, implicit learning. The hockey player doesn't necessarily know the physics behind how the puck moves. He just makes a series of weak correlations, from cause and effect, to understand his own set of actions, come to some conclusion. But this doesn't actually mean that he understands the physics behind it. This is Isaac Newton throwing an apple in the air, watching it fall to the ground, or Galileo, and having some kind of implicit understanding of gravity. But that doesn't mean that he understands all of the actual mechanics behind it. He doesn't necessarily understand the way that everything seems to be working. And that's pretty much the whole basis of it. machine learning is it's a series of interconnected nodes that's based on the way that like one certain behaviorist model of the brain like allows us to take in experience, to look at things, and have some kind of implicit understanding of whatever systems govern. But like, this isn't really an understanding of the world. If all you can do is make a series of weak correlations to something, then you don't actually know what's going on. You don't have any kind of semantic meaning of it. The example that I like to use of this is last month on Netflix. Netflix has like a very sophisticated machine learning system for recommending what movie I want to watch next. I watched 3 Billboards outside of Ebbing, Missouri, which is like, it's not the best film in the world, but it's this very, very serious, very dramatic story about a single mother whose daughter is raped and murdered. But next week I log back on and I'm given a bunch of family comedies that are of even more questionable quality that are shown to me because they're about families with single mothers in the rural U.S. There's obviously a set of weak correlations happening here, but like it's not the reason that I wanted to watch 3 Billboards outside of Ebbing, Missouri. There's a total disconnect from the actual semantic meaning and like what I'm given. There's an implicit understanding, but that implicit understanding is vitally, vitally wrong. It doesn't actually have any kind of connection to the world. This is because like ML systems, they don't actually understand anything. When you ask Siri about a traffic accident, it doesn't understand like the potential human trauma behind it. If we give a bunch of medical records to an ML system and it's like let's say we're testing some new drug, and it says like of the people that we gave this drug to, 33.7% of people said that they experienced nausea after having this drug. This doesn't mean that the system understands what nausea feels like. It's totally disconnected from the world. All it sees is it takes in information and it finds by way of weak correlation some output. Even though like neural networks are massively, massively intelligent, they have no actual connection to the world. They're only connected to it because they care about things that we care about. They don't have any way to choose what they care about for themselves.
They can have connection. They don't have appropriate model which includes some semantics which would allow to do it.
So what Brian says is that even though ML models are dynamical and they can like change their own structure and so forth, they are still absolutely machines.
Sure.
They are mere tools. It is no different. Like its structure is different, but the way that it operates properly in the Heideggerian sense is no different from that of the hammer.
Sure.
It's merely a tool for us. It doesn't care about anything for itself. As he likes to say, again, using John Howland's words, is that they just don't give a damn. They have no capability to care. This is kind of where ML systems fail. Because they can't have any kind of like epistemology, they have no notion of it. The other main failure that like hasn't been tackled that was still a problem with GoFi and is very much so a problem still with ML is in ontology. So neural networks absolutely lack the logical capabilities encoded into GoFi systems, yet still seem to be able to come to correct conclusions about objects purely by way of implicit learning. But this implies an even weaker understanding. This goes to imply that like the Cartesian model, like the Cartesian notion that understanding must be grounded on clear and distinct ideas seems exactly backwards. So the notion that GoFi systems we're operating on, which is like all parts of cognition are based on logical inference and all of our understandings of objects are based on like, okay, I understand the IDOS of a cup. I know that I know that my hand is a very poor tool for holding liquid. If I try to do it, a lot of liquid often falls out. So I need to develop some tool to have the structural functional organization of allowing me to better like consume liquid. And only by way of understanding that do I understanding this series of like logical inferential events do I actually understand the objects of the cup. But because ML systems can understand what a cup is, or at least label it to some extent, without having any notion of that IDOS, means that we need to change our entire notion of the ontology of objects. This is what Brian's first book was about. So let's go a little bit deeper into the actual epistemological challenges here, and then we'll go into the ontology a little bit later.
Yeah, but just a remark, that's what the inventors of symbolic AI were trying to do, right? Because there you have at least attempt to create functional structure representation of, let's say, cup. Because it's linked to also like it's a tool, it's related to doing this, doing that. It's not really working, but at least it was an attempt.
It was for sure an attempt. We're going to get into symbolic systems a little bit later, and a lot of the failures about like the notion of mechanics in it still persist from like neural networks into the third wave of AI that both Brian and myself agree are like very much so properly still the second wave in their structure and also nature. Even though they're symbolic systems, they're still like they're deep learning networks mixed with some GoFi parts. Like there's some other pieces involved. It's not quite that simple. But. So first wave AI had no resources to ground its abstraction and conceptual symbolization in the richness of the world, giving them a tendency to float free of reality, threatening them to devolve into an endless play of signifiers that signify nothing. That is, like, because GoFi has no way of actually like using an object, even if it has an IDOS, it only cares about it because we told it to. Like again, if we go to the chessboard, it doesn't actually matter. Again, to use John Vervaeke's example, is to like, let's say that Sergey, you and I are playing a game of chess. You're beating me, so I'm getting a little bit upset at that. So I take your queen.
Or not. Right.
I take your queen and I snap it in half. Okay. So you take the pen that I'm using and you're like, okay, this is my queen now, and it's your queen for all intents and purposes. This is your queen now. This follows all the same rules on the playing board that your queen already does. Right. It is effectively a queen. But that doesn't mean that there's no like difference between the queen that I've broken in half and this one. They're still different objects.
Right, because it's basically a pointer to some abstract meaning of the queen.
But because there is no grounding in the world, the GoFi system doesn't see any difference at all.
Well, it depends. If it's dedicated only to chess, it's right. But if it's at the same time dedicated to shapes of figures you're using, it will distinguish the difference.
Sure, but all of that needs to be encoded into it. Like it can't actually make that. It can't come to that conclusion and change its own structure.
But you're just saying that how it was done before. It doesn't. It's not intrinsic property of it.
It's an intrinsic property of the GoFi architecture.
That it can be trained.
That it cannot be trained.
Why it's intrinsic property?
Because the way that GoFi, by the nature of the way that GoFi structures work. Again, going back to the baby plus delta baby equals adults, all cognitive, this is a set of all cognitive capabilities that are here, they still exist here, but this delta baby is just like just accessing them for the first time. And all of your cognitive skills are intrinsic.
It's too complicated example to talk about it, right? Because it's like baby as even a container of something changes a lot during the development. Like wiring changes, myelination is happening, like a lot of different stuff. So it's not even clear what we're talking about it here. It would be easier to talk about some simpler stuff, some physical stuff, perhaps.
The point that I'm making here is that in every GoFi system that's ever been developed, all of its information processing is inherent. Every architecture that exists that isn't like a symbolic system, that is like GoFi again mixed with neural networks, is
mostly it's true, but even like Psych in their later stages started to So I mean,
this is an incorrect statement as far as developmental psychology goes. This is absolutely incorrect. But this is the assumption made by Jerry Fodor and the Delphi system.
I mean, for me, it doesn't have any meanings even as equation, because baby is like instant. Delta baby, what way? It's like piece of the baby? No, it's like a lot of processes, environment.
Well, absolutely. You and I actually totally agree on that. The notion that was here is that, like, cognitively speaking, all of the capabilities of an adult exist in the baby.
Not all of them.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. But this is the, like, if you go through the actual arguments of Jerry Fodor, this is the conclusion that he comes to. He's like, if computation is cognition, and your brain has the capability to perform any kind of cognition at all, that means it can perform any kind of computation, then, like, all cognition is already existing in the mind when it's born. Therefore, there is no such thing as cognitive development. Like, going from the premise that.
But I don't see how it's correct. I mean, Fodor is like a great figure, but it was like in 60s, right?
Hmm?
Fodor is.
This is in the 1970s.
Okay, yeah, like, I mean, close enough. So, like, before we had any sophisticated computers.
Yeah.
So his understanding of computation can be significantly different to ours.
Mm-hmm.
And this like chain you just explained, it doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, why you should have all computations in babies? Like computations themselves can be evolved, right? Sure. And that's what's happening actually.
For sure.
With myelination, for example, you are changing the way you compute stuff.
Yeah. Yes.
Plus, to compute something, you need some, let's say, rules. Like to say it's simple, and you have more rules, so you compute it differently.
For sure. For sure.
So I don't see why it can be just computation.
I'm just trying to find the actual series of arguments in my notes, so that I wasn't exactly expecting to go down this.
Sure. Yeah, great.
Yes. So function and development have nothing to do with each other. So like if there exists some system that can perform every function of computation, therefore if computation is cognition, this being the premise here, then like every function can be performed without any need for development. So if some system has the capability.
Why?
It's just based on the assumption that computation is cognition.
Okay, how you inference it from the last?
So, sorry, are you taking the premise here?
I would say let's start it from the ground. So I would say that yes, cognition is computation, and I don't see.
So if cognition is computation,
right.
Any system that can perform any cognition can perform any function.
Why? No. Like cognition is not just something universal. You can have different levels of cognition, right?
We know this now.
Yeah, I mean, we develop cognition as species and its individuals during the life and during the history. So you can have like different power of cognition.
The assumption here is that if cognition is computation, we can develop some set of like sequential reasoning behind any kind of function that we do.
And it's completely true.
No matter what stage in our life we get to, that is absolutely like any function and any series of functions that we do can be made into some set of instructions that can be followed by a Turing machine.
And it's completely true. Where is the flaw here?
The thing is, if this is the case, we should be able to encode in a single system all of these sets of instructions. This is Jerry Fodor's argument.
Yeah, but it's the same as to say that if you have computer which is capable to run any software on it, you already have all the software.
That is exactly the argument that Fodor is making. Absolutely.
but it's not true. If it doesn't have Microsoft Office, you can't run it, right?
He says that function and development have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Like, he says that because there is like, because all functionality is there.
Functionality.
So humans can perform all set of functions.
But because of cognition.
Because of cognition, and
right.
we know now because of development. Like
right.
we don't. So I don't initially have the ability to read.
What is basically the same way talking about cognition, but again, development part of cognition, right?
Absolutely.
Like basically creating new software.
It is exactly like that. But what Fodor says is that if we have if we are capable of doing any function, any function that we're capable of doing at any point in our life,
but not
requires the amount of cognition that we had when we were babies. Therefore, if we have the capability to do these later, we have the capability to do them as children. We just haven't unlocked.
Well, it's just not correct.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, how you start here?
This is just Jerry Fodor's set of arguments. And this is a basis behind, like, this is an assumption that we have to take that all GoFi systems run.
Not really. Like many of them just don't think about this stuff. Yeah, they're just trying to create the model of the world in like some tools they invented for this.
Yeah, for sure. And all of those tools only actually work in spaces where the GoFi system is omniscient.
I mean, like partially just coincidence because most of them were created many years ago, again, when everything was so bad in terms of computational power, understanding of computer science, absence of good tools, and so on and so on. So everything we see from all times is very limited just because of some technical issues. I mean, if it would be done opposite, like deep learning part would be in 70s and 80s, and now we would have a wave of trying to get it through semantic systems, it could be completely different picture.
Okay. So again, one of the assumptions that I kind of skipped over because I thought I was taking it to be kind of to go with that being said is that in general, semantic relations to the world, including reference, are not effective. I'll go into this a little bit deeper right now, just because I think there's a little bit more background on it. Right. This is one of the absolute principles that went into the encoding of all artificial intelligence. This is not knowing the difference between like the queen and my marker. The proper functioning of any world-directed system, any system that is thinking about or representing or processing information about the world, must be governed by normative criteria, applying it to mechanical operations that are framed in terms of situations or states of affairs in the world the system is representing or reasoning about, which situations and states of affairs will not, in general, cause. Sorry. This is saying that it must be governed by normative criteria as it understands it by way of its mechanical operations, by way of logical inference sequentially, and that are framed in terms of situations and states of affairs about the world that the system is representing or reasoning about, which situations and states of affairs will not, in general, be within effective causal reach. What Brian means by causal reach is like not being able to see the fire underneath the tree line. That's not necessarily in causal reach. It doesn't exactly see that. This model is insufficient because the world, to be intelligible, must manifest some degree of time and distance spanning correlation. At any given place and moment in time, smoke can only be recognized as signal of fire if and only if the causal efficacious presence of smoke reliably correlates with the fact that something is burning. At any level at which we find it intelligible, the world must be partially connected and disconnected from the system that is trying to interpret it. We must be able to look at the world as world purely objectively, and also look at our representation of the world and say, based on our representation of the world, what is the actual potential set of causes for what is happening that we don't necessarily see the cause of?
Oh, but how it's separated? We don't have opportunity to see a representation and the world itself. All we have is just its representation, right?
I mean, to a certain extent, yes, but your representation is built on your understanding of reality.
But still, that's all you have. I mean, how you can compare
Well,
it?
if all you have is the representation, how can you build a representation from a pure representation?
No, your presentation is built based on reality, but you have access only to representation.
But if you have access only to representation, like we're getting back to the baby plus delta baby argument here. It's a homuncular point. If we have nothing but representation, how can we build our representation?
Okay, but what else do we have that part beyond the representation?
Beyond the representation, we have sensory input.
Yeah, the sensory input. I'm pretty sure that we're okay.
We're talking about the input.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So, like,
but I mean, it's the input is not reality.
Sure. To a certain extent, like if we want
Like to huge extent. Like for example, you were talking about vision. It's 2D, right? Reality is not 2D.
Well, okay, let's talk about creating a three-dimensional representation based on reality. From this perspective, like I can if I turn my computer to be this like such a way that like the screen is totally flat, I'm making it such that in the video image, like the screen is a totally one-dimensional thing.
Two-dimensional.
No, like it's simply a line on like to the camera.
Okay. Yeah.
If I then move the screen,
Mm-hmm.
then I can see that it is a multi-dimensional thing. And
Okay.
I can create a representation based on my experience of the world that like this is not merely what it looks like, and I hold that in memory. This is me taking something that's not necessarily in effective causal reach,
Right. But
taking that in based on sensory input, and using that to augment my momentary understanding of the world. This is me having gone camping before, having made a fire that made smoke that goes over the tree line, looking at a forest, seeing smoke, and saying, "Oh, hey, there must be a fire there." Because even though I don't necessarily see the fire, I know that smoke is a signal of fire. But to make that decision, I must augment my understanding of this world, separate myself from what is directly in front of me, from my sensory input, and based on my understanding of the world that was once within causal reach, I learned that this is a signifier of that. I learned that the fire is a signifier of smoke. So smoke is a signifier of
But
fire.
how do you learn it initially? You again
You experienced
observed it.
Yeah. You observed it. You experienced it for sure.
Yeah. So you created it part of your model of the world, and that's how you recognize it.
So like when I am looking at the forest and the smoke, I am connected with the world.
Connected.
I am connected with the world. I am merely perceiving.
Okay.
And I'm taking the image that my eyes are seeing,
Yeah.
and I'm using that image to create an understanding of my momentary like surroundings. But I'm disconnecting myself from the sensory input, from this understanding of reality, to say, based on like the other sets of causal factors that I understand, I can know that there is something causing this plume of smoke to rise. That is not necessarily within my set of sensory input immediately.
Right. I just can't get what the importance of this separation of input and processing of it, processing of model.
I see. So the thing is, a GoFi system, by assumption, like by its very nature, by the assumptions that govern it, cannot actually separate itself from its representation.
What? Sorry. Wait. So what? Like itself, it's a completely other story, right? We're talking about separation of input and the representation.
We're talking about the representational mandate. We're talking about being able to separate your momentary set of like inputs, your momentary understanding of the situation, and augmenting that with your previous experience.
Semantic part, which is inference based on the model, which is somehow separated from input, right?
But what I'm saying is that by way of the architecture of the system, if there isn't fire immediately present, if it is not aware of the fire, it cannot come to the conclusion that fire is there.
Why? It can. Like all this knowledge graph even can allow it. it's like simple inference. If you have like smoke in these conditions, then it's signal made by fire. Like it's easy to create.
Wait, but that we're talking about Go-Fi system.
Yeah, we're not talking about.
Yeah, but it's like all this, for example, psych, right? Basically, it's knowledge graph. It's just a lot of connections between different.
But what are we arguing here? That Go-Fi system cannot do that, so it can, but you have to like, program it. What are we arguing about?
Yeah, so we're talking.
I'm saying that the system can't come to this conclusion for itself, even if it knows that like, even if it says like where there's fire, there is smoke. It can't.
But what is by itself? Without having it as a part of the model.
Without having the notion coded into it, without having it be within its realm, like without having the fire in this model be within its realm of awareness.
But it's the same for people. We don't have this knowledge. We can't make this inference.
So do you remember the example that I gave you last week of like we have John, Mary, and David, and how they're looking at each other, and is a married person looking at an unmarried person?
Okay.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
These Go-Fi systems cannot like take the information that we have that like I know that marriage is binary. Therefore, like either
it depends on
unmarried.
representation you created for marriage. It can be multidimensional, and it can include anything you want theoretically.
Okay, but I'm pretty sure that we're not arguing about that Go-Fi systems cannot have these representations. They can.
Yeah, but this is exactly the point that they intrinsically can't, right?
No,
so they cannot learn it.
They cannot like, take if they didn't have the information initially within their structure, they cannot add that to their structure.
Why?
Because they can't rewrite their own code.
Well, it's not code. It's basically you have representation in case of something like site, it's like graph, yeah? And you have code which operates over this representation. Sure. And code is the same, but you can add new nodes to this graph which represent new knowledge.
This architecture,
but that's not Go-Fi system.
Yeah, that is not Go-Fi. It is. No, it's not.
What is site? It's not deep learning.
Well, right, but psych is not knowledge graph. And
basically it is.
No, it's vitally not. We'll talk about authenticity a little bit later once we've talked about the ontology of objects.
Okay, but even here, let's clarify it. We should agree that psych is Go-Fi, or we should say that there are different other type of AI, and we should discuss them too, right?
So what we're talking about here is that there is no current model for artificial intelligence that can actively explain all of psychology.
Currently.
That is the thesis of Brian's book.
Oh, okay, but it's a safe statement. But what I've heard that something like it's intrinsically impossible.
It's intrinsically impossible on Go-Fi architecture.
It should be proved somehow.
Okay, let me start at the beginning.
Okay.
Let me go all the way.
Yeah, we can.
I obviously assumed too much knowledge here.
Yeah, we can go to the end, then go back.
Are you trying to push him to say that it has to have an agency?
I'm not
pushing.
We're not
thinking
even
about
there
this
yet.
argument.
We're not even there yet. So
yeah. Let's go forward. Then we'll because
I want to clear this up because this is important.
Sure.
So there are 4 vital failures of Go-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is neurological. Our brain doesn't operate on like 4 or 5, like a small number of streams of sequential processing. Instead, like neurologically speaking, we create our representation by way of the power of massive parallelism.
But why it's important? Any parallelism can be represented as sequential processing.
I disagree. You can't necessarily represent, like, what about insight reasoning?
I mean, by default, any computation can be represented as sequence.
What is the sequential action of you seeing a chair and recognizing it as a chair?
Well,
taking the sensory input.
Right.
And coming to a conclusion based, like, one, forming that representation, and forming that representation in such a way that you actually find it meaningful.
okay, where is parallelism, which can be computed as a sequence?
Sorry?
You said that you disagree that any parallel computations can be done as a sequence.
Yeah.
So can you illustrate it?
Sure, I can. So this is the 9-dot problem. This is the most simple example of insight we're doing. Let's say that this is a perfectly spaced 3x3 grid.
Okay.
Most people, actually in psychological testing, 99.8% of people, because most children in the modern era do connect the dots games when they are a child, they will think that the endpoint of these lines, okay, also, the goal is to connect these 9 dots by way of 4 connected lines. You cannot lift up your pen and the lines must be straight.
Yeah.
They will always assume like, okay, this should work. Oh no, I've missed a dot. Like any example where like you end the lines at like where the dot must be an endpoint of a line, there will always be one dot that is not touched. So to be able to make this change, be able to understand that that like you are fixated on an incorrect set of observations here. That's restructuring, cognitively speaking, and also like it is shown on MRI scans and so forth, is an active restructuring of the way that the brain is firing.
Okay.
This is a spontaneous thing. It's called a spontaneous thought. This is the way that John speaks of it. The actual way that you need to solve this is you need to go here, then here, then here. Imagine that this crosses through this line.
Yeah.
You go back across here, and then up.
Yeah.
You need to break the frame that says that these dots must be endpoints.
So now going back to parallel versus sequence, like how it's illustration that they can be solved sequentially.
It can be solved sequentially if you have this representation, if you have this model that like the endpoints must not necessarily be aligned in that, but it can't come to that conclusion for itself unless you coded that other like representation or way of thinking about the problem into it.
Right, but
you can't restructure the problem.
Unfortunately, we don't have CEO today, but he's a big fan of generating hypotheses. And basically,
we generate the hypothesis for ourselves. It is me saying like, okay, my hypothesis of anything that I'm asked to connect a bunch of dots. My hypothesis of that, as I was trained as a child, is that the endpoint of the line must be on a dot.
That's your initial hypothesis. Then you exhaust them, you see it doesn't work, and you're looking for a better one. And one of them will be outside the frame, and it's sequential. You do it after exhausting previous version.
Yes, but that restructuring itself, even if I pull up Sia's model right here, let's talk about this in terms of Sia's model of generating hypotheses. So let's say that I have some knowledge graph here that you want to speak about, and I want to restructure that knowledge graph. So I have a spontaneous restructuring.
It's not, yeah.
That spontaneous restructuring, even in Sia's own example, is totally non-sequential. This restructuring itself, as I reset it, it comes to
what is saying that you run it in parallel technically with this computer right now?
Sure.
You can run it with one core sequentially.
This is a metaphor for an example that is not nearly having cognitive capability. But the act of restructuring your thought, neurologically speaking, is a spontaneous process.
Spontaneous process sounds great, but
you're a biophysicist.
Right.
You of all people should know how the cortex works.
Yeah, I'm a little bit aware about it, about these details, but I completely agree it works a lot in parallel. My point is that it still can be presented in a way that you can do the same computation sequentially.
For sure. The point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that this was a major critique that was given to GoFi, was one of the main parts of it that led to the development of neural network systems. It was the thought that it doesn't actually resemble the way that the brain performs cognition. The second point is a perceptual point. That is that most GoFi systems, actually pretty much all of them, assume that sensory input would be the simplest part of intelligence.
Simplest part of intelligence. What does it mean?
So that means that like the easiest part of designing the system is making it be able to like make a representation for itself. This
so
was vitally not the case.
it's what? Itself, it's what?
So let's say that we have a camera, we have some set of sensors that a system is using to take in the world.
Yeah.
It was assumed that it would be very, very easy for the machine to recognize objects as objects, to make a model of the world for itself.
Well, it was a hope, yeah.
It was a hope, for sure. It was vitally not the case.
Okay, but it doesn't mean that it's intrinsically wrong. But again, because it's computationally quite intensive process, and it was more or less impossible to create something reasonably well working in those years.
Well, the ontology of objects up to that point said that it was still Cartesian. The simplest part of recognizing object, of like creating a model of the world is recognizing objects. But the failure of GoFi showed us that that wasn't the case, and the success of ML, of machine learning, of statistical learning, of not inferential understanding of the world, but implicit learning, showed us that we had to change our notion of ontology. Because again, like as a child, I don't understand the way that the ball works inferentially. I understand it because I implicitly come to a conclusion of how it works.
Well, it's more or less the same.
Like the ontology of objects had to change.
I mean, you just, as a child, started with some simple regularities, right? And then you go to more and more complicated. But because we don't have conscious access to all of it, you see only how does it work to some extent. I mean, you can see it just to some extent, only for a very small part of your cognitive process. But more or less it's just the same process, but it's more and more complicated. We're going to more and more abstract parts. And the fact that at the end of the day we manipulate only with the most abstract stuff doesn't mean that like visual stuff doesn't use the same representation.
So I'm trying to realize some problems with the way that I structured this presentation. This is the first time that I presented anything in like the last 5 years.
Okay.
So I'm going to show you an example that Brian uses, which is an image.
Yeah, you just always use.
And that is, it's a piece of artwork.
Okay.
So this is an image of a studio that was designed by, it was a representation of this is the way that a computer sees a room. It's impossible to parse.
Oh, I mean, it's still possible because I see some regularities here, so computers can do it too, right?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. It depends on an implementation for sure, but
you have an ontology of objects that you've built up over time implicitly.
Well, but starting with, can you recognize some lines here, even if it's like
Sure,
there is a lot of
lines,
right? And then you can recognize some shapes.
So one thing that I wish that Brian did is if he just took an actual image of whatever this was a representation of to show you side by side what he thought the computer saw relative to what we saw. Essentially, it's an image that is impossible for us to parse as the actual objects in it.
For us as a people?
Yes. So like this is a room with people in it, with a couple of television screens in it.
Here?
Yes, in that image.
Well,
it's impossible to parse that based on that image itself.
Yeah, I don't see TVs here at all.
That's exactly the point that he's trying to make. He says that this is the way that a GoFi system would represent its fails. The only way to actually allow that system to understand everything that is there is to give it the structural functional organization within its own code. To make it omniscient in the system and already understand how everything works.
Right. And
you need to,
that's what I is trying to do, right?
Not necessarily, because this is what I mean by baby plus delta baby equals adults.
When you're saying not necessarily, you're just saying that not in all cases, but there can be cases where it's possible, right?
Again, this is saying that like the deep blue system that beat Gary Kasparov in chess,
right,
understood all of the rules of chess going in.
Right, formal rules, yeah.
Yeah, it had no capability to learn those rules for themselves.
But it's possible now.
It's possible now, but it wasn't possible. Like we're talking about why this system failed.
We're talking about previous century.
Yeah, we're talking about why this model of intelligence failed.
You were talking about Deep Blue. It wasn't a particular model. It was a combination of a lot of different models, and like big part of it, it was just extensive search of combinations. So it wasn't like it wasn't close to how we play chess at all.
For sure, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's still possible to do. I mean, just one wrong implementation doesn't mean that it's impossible.
No, it doesn't mean it's impossible. But that the reasons why this system fails, this architecture, this style of design, is because of its inability to learn. Because of its inability to create, to use its representation of the world to improve its representation of the world.
Well, so the key point is it possible to make them learn, right?
Not based on the architecture that they initially had.
Yeah, but again, it was so many years ago.
For sure. We're using these as a set of examples to go through a larger progression.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean,
let's can we start?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
With this?
Yeah.
We actually have more people on the call.
Okay. Yeah. Perhaps they have some questions.
He is on the call, so see if you have any questions, just let us know. I'll try to find out what's wrong with the audio. Sorry for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
The other failure is epistemological. This is what I'm talking about with the inability to learn. The intelligence of these systems is purely based on logical inference and had very poor abilities to parse novel information. This is again talking about Brian's own arguments here.
Mm-hmm.
He says that they had no way to expand their understanding. Within the actual architecture of this old system, it had no way to expand its understanding of the world, which leads to an ontological point, which is that everything that it understands must be predefined.
Yeah, but again, we're talking about specific architectures. We're not talking that it's impossible in general, right?
Well, again, to get to illustrate the larger points that Brian is trying to make,
Mm-hmm.
We need to understand the ontological failures of systems that came before.
Okay.
So, what essentially this means is that the GoFi system it's only able to parse the inferential content of a concept that is already encoded in the system.
Yeah, it would be better to use some past tense to talk about it, right? Because it's pretty simple. It sounds like a general rule, but it's not. Or you should prove that it's impossible in general.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying as far as the structure of the argument goes.
Okay.
But this is so far a historical account.
Right. So that's why past tense would be more appropriate here.
Should I wear a mic? I'm just seeing Sia's point.
Oh, it's okay.
Just use. You don't need that mic.
Okay. So this is again. So there was a set of problems in the 1970s, 1980s,
Mm-hmm.
and to improve on them, the neural net people said, here's a potential set of solutions.
Not even improve because it comes like completely different solution.
Yeah, it was a totally different approach.
Yeah.
Right. It said okay, neurology based on the actual.
Now this stuff is fitting.
Yeah. Okay. I turned it up.
Okay, cool.
So like where ML systems essentially are strong where GoFi fail. They have a very, very good capability to learn, and that's pretty much all that they can do, really.
Yeah, but to learn some kind
They
of
learn in a very, very siloed sense.
Not it's not only this difference. Basically, they're focused on patterns which weren't in the focus of old systems, right? Because old systems were focused on like logic, semantic, and so on, and new systems are focused on like some local connections.
Yeah, it's based on
local regularity.
It comes to a conclusion based on a series of weak correlations.
Right.
That is like again the functional architecture of every ML system. Is it finds some series of weak correlations between some set of things, such that it can use these set of weak correlations to come to a conclusion.
Right.
This is vitally different from the approach that GoFi takes.
Absolutely right.
And that's the reason why it could potentially like create some understanding of the world, so that it could actually learn. These weak correlations are based on tons and tons of training data. I don't think I need to go into this part of it.
Sure.
The neurological argument of saying this is not how the brain works, which I think is quite dismissive, and I agree with you on. That's not really the best argument against the system, but that's its own thing. Like this is mostly solved by the ML system. Like the way that ML learns is also based off of massive parallelism, rather than like a few streams of like very deep sequential processing.
Yeah, but it's mostly for convenience, right? You can compute it as a sequence. It will be just much longer.
Yeah, for sure. The second point is perceptual. Like this is, it can create its own representation of the world. GoFi systems couldn't actually like take an image and recognize the parts of it, whereas now the neural nets can find a series of weak correlations that they can like identify a fire hydrant in an image, as we've all seen with like the Google recaptcha stuff.
Let's say label it.
Yeah. It can label it as a better. This again doesn't mean that the system actually understands what it's talking about. This is what I was mentioning earlier about how like a system that's analyzing the results of respondents of an experimental drug that don't actually understand what it means to be nauseous. The system can look at a massive data set and they're like, okay, I know that 33% of people who took this experimental drug felt nauseous after taking it.
Right, but again, just because it was designed in this way, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, theoretically, it's possible to design it with some semantic representation of all side effects and psychological stuff. We just didn't because
the system can learn it for itself.
I mean, in general, it can. Yeah, we just not now at the stage when we are good enough with the stuff to consider all details of this representation. So people basically focus on the most important ones, and like most important ones, that's what they believe. That's basically a reflection of their beliefs.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is agreed. Okay.
So again, you're right.
Yeah.
In this case, this microphone.
Yes. So what Brian is saying here is that
Can I go back?
So it's where AI systems, like where ML systems properly fail, like they can learn pretty well, and they can label things correctly as far as some kind of understanding that goes. Statistical learning model for sure, but it doesn't actually have any epistemological understanding of the world. So it doesn't care about it. It's still purely a machine.
Well, yeah, we should be careful about saying like they don't care about it. Yeah, like, because you should define how to care first, and because uh, we can say that the RAL systems care about it
Sure.
because that's how they are designed.
This is kind of where I disagree with the way that Brian has structured his book a little bit. I think that he's placed a part of the ontology of objects closer to the start of the book, which is, well, actually, I'll go into that right now because I think that it's fruitful to it.
Good.
This is about authenticity. So he says that, like, if this axis is reckoning, this is like the ability to do what modern computers can do already, to come to some conclusion by way of either statistical or logical inference.
Okay.
To be able to process the world as information. This is authenticity. So an authentic understanding of the world, a purely authentic one, is that of the animal, where it doesn't care about anything beyond what it needs to survive. Like a purely authentic understanding of the world is the antelope that cares little about where it's going to get its next food and whether or not it's being attacked by a predator. All that it considers, as far as we understand it, is what is directly relevant to its survival at that.
Well, it's just some aspects of it because they still create some model of the world. For example, we're talking about mammals, which would be more fair, right? They create some abstract representation of the space,
for sure,
and it's not. At the end of the day, you need it to be more successful when you're surviving.
Yeah, for sure.
But
it only
it's more or less separated parts. Yeah, so, it's not involved at the moment when predators appear.
Yeah. The notion of authenticity is purely based on like what it cares about in the world. So this is like photosynthetic to. We're going to get into what he calls the 7 points necessary for genuine intelligence. But the necessary intentional goal is to go through like the epistemological challenges with AI so far, and then get to this point where we're considering ontology properly.
Yeah, but can we finish with Richard first? I mean, why orthogonal stuff?
So the thing is, an authentic understanding of the world is one that's purely connected to the world. It doesn't care about the world as like so.
What is purely connected? So without any model of it?
We both agree that because the ML system and the GoFi system only care to represent the things in the way that we represent them. Like they're the conclusions that especially ML systems come to are only important because they are important to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't reinforce them to come to those conclusions.
Yeah, but like from perspective of the models themselves, like in RL, they like believe that this like punishment and rewards, that's what's important for them, right? And it's more or less the same for us as people, right?
Not exactly.
So what's the difference?
So the difference between like caring purely about punishment versus reinforcement is like no matter how much I reinforce it to you that book is red, or that this is a red marker, it will not change your perception you built for yourself.
It's not completely true. I mean, it's possible.
No matter how much I tell you you're wrong, no matter how much I like punish you for it, you will never see this pen as red.
Some people see stuff which others can't because of their beliefs, right?
Sure.
And those experiments when like many people saying that this stuff is black, even it's white, and there's like a new person who like listening to all of them, and this person believes that it's not black but it's white. So you can't shift it. But again, it's not the main point. I just trying to understand why we have this orthogonality between inferences and authenticity. I mean, what is X?
This is what Brian. So Brian describes it as authenticity. This is like a pure commitment to the world as a world without any kind of really care for representation. Where like the representation
Without any model of the world.
But without any model of the world that isn't totally related, that isn't totally relevant to like my livelihood immediately. Like the purely authentic. He describes the nature of creatures, of like this thing that is the pet that only eats and sleeps and goes for walks. It doesn't really. It doesn't seem to have any kind of interest in anything beyond its living.
But they still have differences.
Some amount of.
So it's not orthogonal, right?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Like let's bring it to an even simpler level. Let's bring it to like how much of the world does an amoeba care about?
The world care about you? Or
so you know, like an amoeba, like a single
amoeba, yeah.
How much of the world does the amoeba care about?
What is care about? How good is model of the world? That would be the question, yeah.
What parts of the world is it considering? It's not considering like even though it doesn't really necessarily.
Basically, it's completely the same as for people. It's just what is accessible through the senses of amoeba and what can be processed of the model of the world amoeba has.
The conclusion that Brian is kind of asking us to come to is that humans care a lot more about what is happening outside of our like necessary survival than most other animals.
Just because we have richer model of the world.
Exactly.
But it's not it's quantitative difference.
Yeah. So this is because like the animal's model of the world is more so about what is relevant to it, like what it cares about. But
it's the same for people. Like what would be an example?
We choose to care about them. Like we have the capability to care about mathematics, but like a tiger doesn't care about mathematics. Everything that it knows, it pretty much knows implicitly. Everything
right, because
it knows how long it can jump because it has jumped that distance before.
But exactly the same for people because for some people math is important, but several reasons. Some of them is surviving. They do it for as a job, right? It's the same as some skills for tigers. So what's the big difference here?
Well, like it must.
Tigers play. They do some stuff just for fun.
So what he means by this is that it must be an internal operator in the world. It must be able to like actually have some kind of intentional effect on it. It must be able to like the animals must be able to come to some conclusion. It must choose for itself. It must have agency to actually like do something with its action. And that choice of action is based off of its connectedness with the world. Whereas a computational system is purely disconnected from the world.
It can be disconnected.
No,
you can't build it without connection to it.
So let's go back to the ML system that we were speaking about earlier. This is just an example for a much larger case. You and I both agree that it can label a fire hydrant. That doesn't mean that it understands what a fire hydrant is.
Sure, yeah.
That's being disconnected from the world.
Well, but the model of hydrant is created based on observation of the world, right?
Yeah,
so it's not disconnected. It's connected.
Sure, but it's based on okay. This is we're talking really quite pedantically about the way that ML systems work. Let's say that we have an ML system that's trying to find the difference between cars and tanks.
Okay.
So we give it a bunch of images of tanks, we give it a bunch of images of cars. We train it based on the data, has a very, very low correlation of like what is, like, it seems to get it right the vast majority of the time.
Okay.
Then we feed it an image of a car, and it tells us it's a tank.
Okay.
So we look at it and we say, okay, let's try to see what the actual, like, what's happening here. In this example, let's assume that we can actually figure that out, because oftentimes we as humans can't. But the actual set of weak correlations that the system is using is the angle of the shadow in the image, rather than whether the vehicle captured in the image is a car or a tank.
I mean, it's possible in some implementations, but again, it's not intrinsic properties of the system, because even in deep learning, it's possible to create rich enough representation where you have a lot of features of both classes, and your inference is based on a combination of all of them.
Because it has no agency, it has no actual ability to do that.
Well, it's not about agency, it's about architecture and data set.
So what Brian says...
And how agency would help with it.
So what Brian says is that there must be some kind of intentional standpoint. Like he says that
related to tanks and cars? Like, what would be the intentions?
Well, the intention would be to know that the tank is more dangerous than the car.
Well, it depends. I mean, cars kill much more people, actually.
So let's not dive into that.
No. But we should use some arguments to.
Sure, but a single tank has the potential to kill a lot more people and has the intent, to talk of.
But it's not a tank. It's about
the
tens of people sitting inside of it.
Sure, but let's talk about now we're going into Heidegger. We're talking about the tendency of a certain piece of technology, and I don't think that that's really relevant to this conversation.
Right. I mean, recognition of these classes typically are not based on those stuff, right? But if you are saying that we need agency because tanks are more dangerous for the agent.
What I'm saying is
you are talking about belief of this specific agent, right?
So our goal in developing an artificial general intelligence is to create some synthetic mind. That is, some mind that can come to conclusions for itself,
right?
Can perform
like everything people can do.
Yeah, can have good judgment.
Yep.
Right now, would you trust any model of the computational system to be a babysitter?
But the point of AGI movement that's not what deep learning and something else can do for now.
What Brian is saying is that all deep learning and GoFi and all of the systems that have been proposed since these will fail to be artificial general intelligence. And that being the development of an artificial general intelligence, something that can have good judgment, can consider things with moral capabilities, and can take responsibility for its actions, is the goal of what we are trying to develop.
Yeah, sure. You are talking about specific implementations. Perhaps everybody would agree, including me. But the statement was that machines in general can do it, right?
What do you mean machines in general can do what?
To have cognition.
They can have cognition, for sure. They can have some semblance of cognition, but they can't have
not
judgment.
cognition.
They cannot have judgment.
But judgment, that's exactly part of cognition, not any kind of intelligence.
Yes. This is vitally a part of cognition, but this is a very, very small subset of all cognition. So I'm saying that ML can do a certain kind of cognition, and that's implicit learning. I'm saying that
intelligence, not cognition. For cognition, you should have good enough model of the world.
Under the definition of cognition that we use at U of T Cognitive Science, that's not true.
Okay, and what's the definition?
The definition of cognition that we're speaking of is essentially the ability to process information.
And what's different with intelligence?
So intelligence is a vitally poorly defined term. There is no total accurately. Do you have an operating definition of intelligence that you use? So you're asking me an impossible question here.
Yeah, but we still should agree on something. But okay, yeah, it's more about definitions. For me, cognition is a specifically kind of intelligence which is capable for judgment because of good enough representation of the world.
So I think that we're reaching an agreement here. So let's talk about what's necessary to have this, Brian calls it genuine intelligence, which is it's essentially it's the set of necessary and sufficient conditions to have judgment.
Okay.
As he describes them. To have a machine that's actually capable of taking responsibility for its actions. He says that the system must have a certain orientation. It must be before we go pedantically, I just want to describe all 7 of these points. The world must be oriented towards that which it represents, not merely oriented towards or involved with its representation. It must be intentionally oriented towards the world. This means that it must be able to distinguish the difference between appearance and reality. This is the second point. To be able to orient itself towards something, the system must be able to distinguish an object from a representation of it. I know that an object to know that an object is an object is to know that it exceeds your grasp. Like there's probably a lot more happening in an object than I understand.
So basically, we're looking that like important part of judgment is understanding of limitations of the judgment.
Exactly.
Okay.
The third point is that it must have stakes. The system must be able to defer to that object. It must know that there is some danger in its being more committed to its representation than to the world.
Why it's important?
This is the notion that this is Searle saying that when we have word and worlds, we have symbol and we have object. When word and world part company, when our representation of an object is no longer accurate, the world must win. This is kind of the thing that we were arguing about beforehand, that you were trying to use the term, for example, of the illusionist.
Right, because in reality we don't have any notion of real world. We have only representation of it. So who is going to win? Like, I don't see the field of this battle.
How do you mean? I think my computer may have just run out of battery.
Oh, do we have a charger?
I do actually. I have one right there. I just couldn't reach in that position.
No, let's do it.
Okay. Yeah, let's take a short pause.
Great, yeah. And drink some coffee, perhaps?
I'm sorry, I wasn't quite prepared for this kind of pedantics.
That's totally fine.
No, not for time here.
That would be cool if you could just turn off your mic for a second and make sure that we can hear you.
Turn on your mic, you mean?
Yeah, turn on. Yeah, okay, awesome. We can hear you. That's perfect.
My just ran out of battery. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. Okay. Question. Do you have some napkins because like our events?
No, like, or it's better to go to wash the hands. Yeah.
No, I'm struggling to be able to actually present my arguments here.
No. To go up.
You mean to the
going back to we were just at the stakes of the world. It's important, like why it's directly important to have a system that aligns with reality, is that oftentimes in like animal cases, if you have a representation of the world that is not accurate, it's like absolutely dangerous to you as an animal in the world. Like if you think that you can jump a much further distance than you can, you're potentially putting yourself in very, very, very real danger. If this is how our system evolves, like there are actual stakes that if the representation of the world is wrong, then the world must win. Like if I think I can jump farther than I can, and I try to jump across like a canyon that is longer than I can, I will fall down and likely die. That's the stake of that like pair of arguments. The fourth part is legibility. I must be able to find an object intelligible in the world. I must be able to parse one must be able to parse their environment and understand it both as representation and as object. Like it must be able to understand. It doesn't exist purely virtually. It doesn't exist purely as representation. It also exists as an object in the world, and I must be able to separate those two things. I might only be able to represent it in my own head, in representation. But that doesn't mean that I'm not representing something in the world. The fifth point is understanding the difference between actuality, possibility, and impossibility. This is like I must understand what is the case about them, like what is actually happening with an object, what is it actually doing, what is not the case about an object but could be the case, what is possible. Like I must be able to consider that there are multiple uses for any given tool. There are multiple possible ways that something can be done or can be represented, or can perform certain actions. And the third point is that I must understand what could not be the case about something, what is impossible about some object, some concept. This is like what he means by there must be some understanding of actuality, possibility, and impossibility. These are requirements to be able to perform rational thought. And this is rational thought as the ability to consider multiple permutations of the same situation. Mm-hmm. And by understanding these multiple permutations of the same situation of what is actual, possible, and impossible, I must come to a conclusion of what is the most reasonable course of action. The sixth is commitment, is that I must not only be able to distinguish appearance from reality, words from worlds, but I must actually actively care about the difference. This kind of touches back on the stakes argument that I must understand that if I misunderstand the world, if my representation is different from reality, there are actual consequences to that. So because of that set of consequences, I must be committed to creating a representation of the world that is as close to reality as possible. The seventh, this is kind of, I think, a little bit pedantic, and this is where I started to take issue with Brian's arguments, is a sense of self. Like an understander, human, AI, whatever, cannot take an object to be an object until that understander takes itself to be a knower that can take an object to be an object. That is it must be the understander must know about the object that must be here in the world, and that we must be here in the world to interact with it. Yeah, that's essentially what we're saying. We must know that both we and it are here in the world, and there is some world facilitating the interaction between me and the object. What do I mean by world here? It is whatever environments that you exist within, that we are interpreting. To be able to trust this environment is real, a fourfold commitment must be maintained. We must hold the object accountable for being a part of the world. We must, again, going back to stakes, we must understand that an object that we are interacting with has some set of like active consequences in the way that we can interact with it as part of the world. Um, reciprocally, we must hold the object accountable. We must hold the world accountable for hosting the object. Like we must consider it to be not only like we must consider not only the object as part of the world, but that like the world contains the object. Against that, and we must also believe that like we ourselves are maintained by the same relationship. That like we are both a part of the world. That like we are hosted by the world, and we are contained as part of that world itself.
Mhm.
That is that like we are ourselves some object that exists in the same space, governed by many of the same rules as whatever object we're interacting with. This is like this is where we can actually get to the notion of reckoning and judgment. This is like for an understander to be able to think about or be oriented towards the world beyond it, a world with which it copes and through which it navigates. The system must actually like be able to distinguish the difference between reality and representation, and choose reality. It must choose to align its understanding of the world, not towards its representation, and just kind of go deeper and deeper into the symbolic deliberation of symbols that signify nothing. It must understand that the symbols signify something in the world, and actually desire to make that like understanding of reality further from abstraction and closer to that like system of world itself. Does all of this make sense so far?
I mean, it's clear what you're saying, but like argumentation, honestly, I just don't want to interrupt because.
Yeah, let's keep it for the
I'm just
Q&A.
asking for
Okay.
clarifying questions.
Yeah, it's clear.
Cool.
All existing systems with machine intelligence, GoFi or ML or symbolic, represent the world in ways that matter to us and not to them. Because computers are purely information processors and not agents, whether they can learn or not,
are merely coming to a conclusion that means like whether the system can learn or not, it comes to a conclusion that actually means nothing to that system itself. Like it has no inherent objective meaning. Like the fact that the ML system can like label it can label the fire hydrant as a fire hydrant doesn't mean that it actually cares about it as an object in the world.
In real system, yes.
Yeah. This is again using John Haugen's words that the machines don't give a damn. For a synthetic mind to be able to perform judgment, to have genuine intelligence, it must be an internal operator in the world. Its choices must have stakes to itself. It must follow this like sevenfold set of conditions. That like it must be committed to the difference between appearance and reality. It must be committed to like wanting to have an actual representation of reality and being able to like question itself of the difference as a function of its own choice, of its own agency. Um, like so let's consider a few things about this. Brings us back to the reckoning versus authenticity graph. There's a few like vital points of this. Looking at this graph, we consider that like the authenticity axis describes creatures or animals that otherwise register the world in ways that are appropriate to and do not exceed their existential engagement with the world. This is the important point that I was trying to make about the antelope, that like it doesn't actually care about anything beyond its survival. Like its understanding of the world is purely authentic. It doesn't really like necessitate things outside of its existential engagement with the world.
Sure. It can't make any inferences and reckoning.
It can do some amount of reckoning, sure, but the reckoning is pure.
It's clear.
Well, okay. This is I think this is more metaphorical than anything else. It's saying that like I'll use a different example. Like when Siri tells us that there's a traffic accident, it doesn't actually have like an authentic understanding of how dangerous a traffic accident is. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Evaluation of it.
Hmm?
Has some evaluation of it.
It has some like representation of it, sure, but it doesn't have like an understanding of it in the like qualia emotional sense. It has no understanding of that trauma.
Yeah, because the notion of the accident was conveyed by humans, so
Exactly.
it wasn't learned, so
It-
it was pre.
And no, but in this case, what is important, but that it was created without emotional representation of the stuff.
Yes.
So it can be created with emotional representation of it.
Yes, but that doesn't mean like so. This is like it has an understanding of the notion in terms of reckoning, but not in terms of authenticity. This authenticity comes from like the choices having actual stakes in the world. Like having like where if it made a mistake, it is in danger itself and danger that it understands and embodies.
Yeah, you can kill any artificial systems if they make wrong inferences.
But does it actually care about that fear?
In reinforcement learning, sure,
Well, that care is not a function of agency.
it is. This is the only function of agency,
How do you mean?
like connection. What you name it as connection to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, yeah, Pasha offering to continue discuss later.
So like this is kind of where the book stops presenting. Like after this point, he says like these are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a system to have actual like potential for judgment, to be like a sentient thing that thinks for itself. From here, he essentially says because no system exists beyond this, that has these capabilities, that has this kind of commitment to the world of its own volition, um, that there is no existing system that can have judgment. To go back to this, like we can only have judgment when we have like a deep connection with the world as world, and we have we have strong reckoning potential. Humans can perform very like advanced mathematical thoughts, advanced mathematical equations. Like we can perform great reckoning, but we also have a very authentic understanding of the world. We are committed to understanding our world as worlds. Reality must exist as reality, otherwise we put ourselves in very real danger. Whether this is like in terms of propaganda and believing some political reality that's different from the actual one, which can lead us towards some other set of dangerous delusions, or this is based on like something as simple as whether or not you can jump across a certain gap. There is real danger to us as things that have a sense of self, that want to preserve ourselves, to actually have some notion like of the world as world and be committed to it. The AI system, even in reinforcement learning, doesn't actually fear its own death. It has no sense of fear to have that.
What is fear?
It is an emotion.
Yeah.
It is
What is emotion?
it's a part of authentic understanding.
But computationally.
The answer is I don't know. How do you quantify?
How we can discuss it without like any understanding of it?
Well, I guess the main point here is that you need agency in order to perceive the world in a way that creates the meaningful representation about it. So you can only perceive the.
So it's like even having agency, like in reinforcement learning, is not enough
Yeah.
from the perspective of the author.
Absolutely.
Okay.
He's saying that like to be able to care, you must be able like the machine must be able to be held responsible for its actions.
What is to be responsible?
So like when you let's say that like you are
I have quick question.
Yeah.
So this discussion reminds me of the people talking about what is the difference between a human and a philosophical zombie. Does he talk
I
about
see.
this at all?
He doesn't actually mention like the notion of the existential zombie necessarily, but I think he does kind of like consider it. he does also say that like there are a lot of humans that don't understand judgment, like that can't perform good judgment. The thing that he's trying to say here is like, if we want an artificial intelligence, like, he uses the example in a couple of talks that he did of his son when he was like playing baseball with his son, and like they hit a ball and it breaks the window next door, and he needs to teach like the valuable moral lesson that you need to take responsibility for your actions, that you've caused inconvenience for the other person.
It's the same how reinforcement learning works, right?
How do you mean?
Like if you do something wrong, you are punished, and you learn that you shouldn't do it.
Okay. I feel like I lack the like total philosophical background to be able to have like a vital argument about this, and the total understanding of reinforcement learning to be able to argue that point. The more interesting thing that I think here is like, so the vast majority of proper like professional academics that have read Brian's work think that it's almost impossible to refute.
What do you mean?
Like it's the notion that these are machines that don't care about the world. They only care about creating representations that we give them to interpret is one that isn't, I think, answerable. That isn't not only I think, but like John Vervaeke, Nick Bostrom at Oxford, a bunch of people at MIT, all think that like the arguments that Brian is presenting are impossible to refute. That we will not actually have a general intelligence that can actually care about the world as worlds and take responsibility for their actions, in like almost a legal sense, until it exists as like an agent on the same level as humanity. Until it creates like until it can actually have the ability to care about the world. And a large part of like why I wanted to present this is because I think that a bit of a notion of Sia's model has the potential to do this, but not based on the way that he's described it to me so far.
I mean, perhaps we should continue to the end of presentation, then go
This
back
is-
to here.
So this is the point in the presentation where like a lot of what I'm going to be saying from here is conjecture. This is my initial thought that I'm arguing for in a larger paper that I'm writing for both my cognitive science course and that John Vervaeke wants me to publish. That is largely based on the notion of Sia's model and Terence Deacon's notion of teleodynamics. And that is like, if we create a system that has sufficient potential to have an emergent intelligence in the same way that biology does, are both is I know that Sia is familiar with this. As far as I understand it, I know that you're familiar with like that notion of teleodynamics as well. Are you familiar with Terence Deacon? Yeah, you are. Okay.
Last time I listened to him was like yesterday.
Oh, okay. So, what I'm thinking is if we take Sia's model here, and we have like some understanding of like a teleogen of some sort, if we can create a computational like thing that has some like an actual cell that has agency, and organize it in such a way that it can actually have emergent properties and become increasingly complex of its own volition, in much the same way that Terence Deacon describes it, there should actually be the potential for an emergent intelligence to come about. It will need to have time to evolve of its own accord. And what is going on here? Like it needs to have the potential to evolve of its own accord and develop its own representation of the world based on not the way that necessarily we represent things, but in the way that the system represents things of its own emergent properties. In the same way that like an octopus evolved in different ways than we did, this system needs to evolve in different ways than either ourselves or any biological thing has. It needs to create its own notion of representation to be able to answer like the questions that Brian asks. Like it needs to be able to evolve and develop of its own accord. And the way that it represents the world, not just running a graph, but something much more abstract than that, is required for answering the questions that Brian Kentwell Smith brings up of like being accountable to the world. It must develop the facilities mechanically that we have of its own accord.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes? Go for it. Go ahead, Sia.
So for accountability, is there any sort of a social agreement? Like, if there is, like, what is accountability?
I see. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. My initial reaction with that is going back to like Aristotelian terms of psychological conformity. So Aristotle said that we have three like checks of reality. There are three tests that we use whether or not something that we're experiencing is real. Um, we have like we have the question of, are my like physical things that I'm using to experience the world working properly? Am I like currently intoxicated? Did I just hear a really loud noise and I'm deaf in one ear, and then I think I hear something? Like, are the physical facilities that allow me to experience the world faulty right now? If they're not, then that test is passed. The second question is whether or not my mind is working properly interpreting it. Whether or not I am, like, at my current state, capable of understanding the world accurately. Am I intoxicated? Like, do I trust that my mental facilities are working properly? The third one is like, is my understanding of the world in agreement with those around me? Which is a bit more dangerous in this case.
In any case, if you special environment, that can be super dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. I don't disagree with that, and that's a big critique of Aristotle's points. And it was like, so the checks of reality were then changed when Galileo came in and started the scientific revolution, and said like, okay, if we know that it is unreliable for us to compare our understanding of the world always purely with reality, a potentially better way of understanding it is by way of mathematics and reliable testing through experimentation. But the thing is, like, I think that this system would need to come about to that ontological conclusion and be convinced of it for itself.
What is itself?
Like,
so it should have cognition, right? Or like consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
What is being convinced? Like,
well, let's consider this in the terms of yourself. When were you convinced that mathematics was able to represent the world?
I'm not convinced.
what? Okay, but it's super complex system. How, like, what I'm trying to see, like, if you saw like my model like doing something, would you be able to tell, oh, the model is convinced now? Like, at what point do you?
The answer is the point where it learns language for itself and is able to communicate with us.
That's a really high bar, but okay.
Yeah, it is a really high bar. So I've been reading Terence Deacon's book about how mind emerged from matter, and I think that like the synthetic mind must go through a very similar evolutionary process that we can potentially speed up by way of like increasing computational power that the system is running on. But like we need to create some kind of situation where there is like the potential for, if not like, if we already have the teleogen, we can have that. But we need to create some kind of like environment where we're facilitating the emergence of teleogens and therefore the emergence of a teleodynamic mind. Where there is some kind of like, it is kind of like the game of life where there's a bunch of different competing models for what the world's going to end up looking like.
Why it's important that it's self-evolved?
Because this is something that we talk a lot about in cogs, where it's like for us to develop an actual understanding of the worlds. So the goal of cognitive science is to put like all of the human mind and all of the human experience into the scientific worldview, to make it such that there is no such thing as qualia anymore. to quantify all parts of our conscious mind. Um, I think that to do that is almost impossible, or that's what won't happen within the next 100 years.
Yeah, but can we have a mental experiment that, let's say we have a thermodynamic system which evolved to something which has all properties you want to consider it as a cognitive system or like a system with judgments and a responsibility, right? But it's synthetic, yeah. So it's like can be it's somewhere in computer, right?
Yeah.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Then we just copy it to
Okay.
another computer.
Like we copy that teleodynamic system.
Correct. The final state of it. So this copied version of it wouldn't evolve by itself, right?
Well, potentially, because so let's bring this back into developmental terms.
Can I can also interject with one point of clarification for Sergey and like maybe for you.
Okay.
So when we talk about, when at least I talk about evolving, at the system involving some kind of evolutionary process, I don't mean that I'm going to evolve a system that is intelligent. I'm saying the system that is intelligent is doing some kind of evolutionary process.
I see.
So that it's, I think it's something to be clear about. I think previously when I talked about this, it was people were confused. They thought I'm trying to evolve an intelligent agent. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to engineer an agent that has an evolutionary process going on inside its head.
I see.
Yeah, actually,
And
I understood it exactly as you describe it right now. Yeah, but it's
right.
still my question works completely the same in this case. Yeah, even if not perhaps exactly, but I mean in any moment of already existing system, you can copy it with all current states of its cognitive processing, right?
Yes, but I would say if that the moment you stop that evolutionary process, you have the system stops being intelligent because it stops being able to build new models.
I agree.
And
That's the GoFi assumption.
Um, Perhaps Sia would disagree that it's like related to GoFi. But perhaps not that important.
Do you disagree?
um, okay, do I disagree? Um, I don't know. With GoFi, like you mean like having rules and then operating with those rules?
So what Sergey said, the way that I'm understanding it, is that like we can devise some system that is capable of like understanding all cognitive, like is the final state of this evolved system, and now has described in some abstract sense all of the rules necessary to perform all cognition.
Right, it's like stable environment, let's say, and you did everything you could
This is
inference already. Yeah?
this is exactly the GoFi thesis. This is the GoFi thesis.
Yeah, that actually sounds very similar. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
This
would
is the
say
GoFi
like the
thesis.
moment you
yeah,
stop
but
to doing that, stop like stop that evolutionary process, stop that abductive process, then the system isn't intelligent in the sense that it's interesting.
I agree.
yeah, I mean, with your definitions here, it's more complicated to discuss because while copying system, we're copying its ability to evolve new
Do you like
hypotheses,
really want me
right?
on camera or?
So, like, what would be the notion of freezing of it? It's
Yes.
basically outside the scope, right?
How do you define freezing?
Exactly. I am saying I didn't define freezing. I said that just copying the system, but by copying I am
meaning with all current computational abilities.
Then it's fine. Like we make babies. Our babies learn from scratch. They learn new things. They're kind of a copy.
Yeah, but not even a baby. Let's say it's adult, and we copy this adult with all its experience and
Yeah, I
ability
don't.
to create new understanding.
Well,
Yeah,
then the
I
system
don't
isn't frozen.
see
It's not frozen. I
what could
just said
go
it's
wrong
adult.
with it.
Well, then that system is still it still has the potential to evolve.
It has, but I just think it's the same system as the previous one, which evolved.
Hmm.
That's fine. I don't see what can go wrong with it.
Hmm.
What's the point of this
So
argument?
initially it was question to the author of the book, I would say,
I see.
or I don't
Honestly,
know how you share it, like why
just
evolvement of the system is
mhm.
so important to consider it responsible for its action, or
Well,
I don't know what I think.
actually, Brian doesn't say that it's necessary for it to be evolved.
Okay, it's your
This is me saying that
okay.
the
So
only
that's question to you in this case.
what Brian's saying is that we won't be able to develop a system that has that kind of this commitment to the world until we finished the entire like quest of all of cognitive science. Until we have a total understanding of the mind, of how we perform all of our cognition, every single part of it, all of our subjectivities, all of our failures, all of our successes, the way that we interpret the world, will we be able to actually create an artificial intelligence that can that can actually like conform to his 7 commitments.
But I believe it's like terrible idea because to understand something you need to model it, right?
Mm.
So basically you have to have model before understanding.
You have to have analysis, then formalization, then
It's still a
optimization.
model. It's perhaps not a computational model, but
Hmm.
still it's still a model. And
Yeah.
but if you have even such model, you can create a computational model of it.
Hmm.
Yes, are we done with the
I think we're done with the
presentation?
I think we're done with the presentation, and it's pure discussion now.
Okay.
The point of the presentation today was very much so because I kind of knew it. Like this is a pretty trusted environment for me at this point. Like I
I
trust
hope
all of
so,
you.
yeah. But
I'm
I'm not too aggressive to
no
my
like
questions.
I came here kind of knowing that you would be aggressive.
Yeah.
I was hoping that we would be able to get through a little bit more of the actual
I
like
hope I'm
basis.
friendly.
Oh no,
Aggressive.
like the rapport is built at this point,
Great.
and I'm pretty okay with like being academically vulnerable with both like the three of you, as well as with Mika, and also like with John. I knew that like John knows where I am in this process, of like writing this paper of a potential answer to the way that we develop a synthetic mind before we have a complete understanding of human cognition. And like I'm totally aware that this is not like a super formal and well prepared presentation, but that's because my conclusions are unclear. And so, like I'm coming here asking for essentially help to come to the correct conclusion. That like my goal is